Hello, everyone. I wanted to talk about a particular thing that I'm starting to see online and around. It's another conspiracy theory, so-called. And I just want to give some initial thoughts on it because I've watched some videos on this stuff and I've read some stuff on it. I've dug around and gotten a little bit of the background on it. And topics of mudfloods, Tartaria, and Antiquitech, and the idea that people, as they have been spreading out across this earth realm, that they are not necessarily building these structures, although, we certainly are building structures uh, with our own technology these days, but that we may be repurposing and excavating these ruined structures that have been left behind from basically a previous world. And It's a really interesting concept for a number of reasons. But first, I'd like to just kind of give a little bit of background on this. I think I'm going to go ahead and just read the whole Wikipedia article on it because it talks about this from several different perspectives, and I'll kind of give a commentary as we go along through here. Um, and then I'll just leave you with some thoughts and understand that this is a particular subject that I have maybe spent tens of hours on. Um, I haven't read a whole lot about it. I haven't done any great digging in detail into primary sources and stuff like that. So, this is kind of an initial thought as to how plausible is this stuff. And I think there's definitely a lot of interesting things here. See, one thing about history, and I studied history in university, is well, there is that idea that it is a lie agreed upon. It's sort of the accepted, politically correct narrative of how things went down in the past. But then history does get stuck in ruts as well. So those of us who have grown up in the West, in Europe, and in the United States, we have a very Western centric view of history. We know very little about other places. Um, and there's other versions of different events and other records and accounts of those events from perspectives and philosophies that are not Western oriented. And I don't have to tell you guys on my channel that we live in a world of deception, and human nature is deceptive. There's always a drive to make one's own people look like the good guys and everyone else look like the bad guys, whereas the truth often lies somewhere in between. And if you're not, sifting through the evidence, you're probably missing out on a lot of stuff. And then there's just entire sections of history and entire people groups that, for whatever reason, historians in the past didn't see them as valuable or worth exploring or recording their stories. And it used to be in the past that historians focused on the wealthy and the powerful, kind of the Schleiman approach to history, the guy who excavated Troy and was seeking after the riches of that city. But things have kind of flip-flopped recently to where the stories of the little guy, the slaves and the downtrodden and the conquered peoples and so forth, has really been magnified. Um, Another example of the seesaw effect, as I call it, where, there may have been an imbalance in some of the viewpoints and approaches of the past. And unfortunately, instead of returning to a sort of more balanced perspective or middle ground, people often then have a reactionary view where they go off the other way. Well, in the past, we only studied the wealthy and the powerful, so now we're going to focus all our efforts on, uh, you know, non-whites and the poor people and the downtrodden and slaves and, indentured servants and things like that. And, I'd say there's benefit to studying all things equally. Uh, Understanding the lives of the rich and the powerful gives us glimpses into human nature, especially how people will behave if they think they can act without consequence due to their wealth or power. And then I think just seeing how the little guy lived and the skills that they were required to have and the lifestyles they lived is valuable as well. It's definitely more relatable for people like me who are poor, working class, basically, and it also gives us gratitude, or it should, for the things that we have in our lives, the technology and other things that make our lives much more comfortable and easy than people had it in the past. Um, but I think we want to have a balance there, and we don't want to politicize it, because the danger there is as soon as you make history political, um, or approach it from a woke perspective or whatever, you are filtering out certain things and you're slanting your narrative and presenting things in a biased light. Um, and that's a problem. Bias is something that historians ideally want to get away from, but the reality is we all have our biases, and no one can fully tear themselves free from that, from the framework and background that they grew up in. We should try, and that's the ideal that we're striving for, but we're never going to quite attain that. And well, it is what it is. Anyway, let's look through this real quick here. And I'll just give you some of my thoughts as we go through uh, on some of these concepts. So, first paragraph here. Tartary or Tartaria is a historical name for Central Asia and Siberia. Ignorance surrounding Tartary's use as a place name has spawned pseudo-historical conspiracy theories, including ideas of a hidden past and mudfloods. Such theories assert that Tartary, or the Tartarian Empire, was a lost civilization with advanced technology and culture. This ignores the well-documented history of Asia, which Tartary refers to. In the present day, the Tartary region covers a region spanning from central Afghanistan to northern Kazakhstan, as well as areas in present Mongolia, China, and the Russian Far East in Chinese Tartary. And some of this kind of goes hand in hand with what I was saying before. There are these areas, the stands especially, that for those of us in the West, they're just sort of like these black areas on the map where you look up the statistics on Wikipedia and you find that these nations are hugely large percent Muslim, but then like culturally and all that, or concerning their history in the West, we just really have no concept or clue about what happened in these vast territories. It's really just a complete blank spot in our knowledge in many ways, and so I studied in university, your traditional Western Civ. So I got a pretty good study of that, and then I did East Asian Civ, but really, that middle Central Asia, didn't get a whole lot of that, really. Um, so yeah, I'll admit that it's there's a lot that I don't know about it, and so I will say this, and I want to be very balanced about this. On the one hand, where there's not a lot of knowledge about stuff, yeah, conspiracy theories can grow in that void of knowledge. But on the flip side, there are definitely periods of history that don't get talked about intentionally and covered up because they're inconvenient for the establishment. The establishment doesn't want certain narratives getting out there. And and again, that kind of goes with my seesaw effect sort of things, where sometimes when certain truths become known, they can be politicized and flip-flopped and overemphasized. Whereas you got to understand that people in the past were products of their time, and they acted accordingly, according to the values and the limited knowledge that they had back then. So uh, trying to judge them according to our modern standards is tricky. It can be some dangerous footing there. Um, I will say this, and this is pretty interesting to think of. Lost civilizations, yeah, they have definitely existed. Um, and we're finding that a lot of myths and legends, uh, I mean, this was the whole Troy story. Everyone thought that the Odyssey and Iliad were just, epic literature. And so, just a quick aside, the Odyssey and Iliad, the works of Homer, they are the second best attested works of antiquity. There's 400 odd manuscripts and fragments that make up the body of manuscripts that we have of the works of Homer. Now, the best attested work of antiquity is actually the Bible. Over 16,000 manuscripts and fragments. 16,000 for the Bible, and then the next best attested is the works of Homer with hundreds. I think it's 400 to 500 manuscripts and fragments somewhere in there. But for a long time, the works of Homer, talking about the Trojan War and things like that, were just thought to be myths, embellishments. And a guy named, I think his name was Howard Schliemann, he actually thought that Troy existed, and he went looking for it where it was located in the works of Homer, and he found the city. And there's other things too, like Atlantis. Was Atlantis where this Richat structure in the Sahara Desert is? And people are paying attention to that structure, and it fits the description of the layout and the concentric rings of the city of Atlantis. And at one point, that whole region had been flooded. It was at the bottom of the sea, so there was some kind of uh, upheaval of because now it's it used to be at the ocean floor, now it's desert. Um, some cataclysmic type things happened to that region of northern Africa apparently. So there's a lot of stuff like this that yeah, there have been lost civilizations. Another lost civilization that's pretty interesting is the mound builder civilization. I've been doing some reading on this in North America. So understand in the Americas, in a lot of cases, people were building with earth structures and like wooden structures, so more natural construction materials, which when those structures were abandoned, they would very quickly be overgrown and reassimilated back into the landscape. And so they're finding now using LADAR surveys and stuff like that, lasers basically at altitude, scanning these jungle and forest regions, and they're able to see the remains and the ruins and the road networks and canals and all these things that were underneath the forest or jungle canopies of North and South America. And understand that these civilizations were extensive and they had infrastructure. They were just using materials that uh, broke down a little more easily than stone and concrete. And so the mound builders in North America are pretty fascinating because you had the Native American tribes that were here in North America at the time that the European explorers came over. But it seems like prior to Europeans coming to North America, there was some kind of war or depopulation event or something because the population of North America was not really on par with other continents of the world. And it seems from a lot of the oral testimony of native tribes like the Cherokee and others that there were these mound builder peoples, and they were quite large. Some of them 7 to 8 feet tall. They had some unusual dental structure, double rows of teeth in some cases. They had red hair and beards. They were likely very fierce, warlike, and cannibalistic. And in their mounds, they're often found buried with hundreds or dozens of executed captives or slaves that are normal-sized people. And so, according to some of these oral traditions, basically these mound builders they had advanced metalworking capabilities, especially copper, and they were a ruling class that ruled over the smaller peoples of North America, but they were very savage. Like I said, they were possibly cannibals, and there was a lot of human sacrifice that they demanded. And so, according to some of these oral traditions, it seems like the native the groups that we think of as the Native Americans wiped out these mound builders. So there's a lot of hidden history that doesn't really get talked about, but slowly it's coming to light. And if you dig for it, you can find some of this stuff, and it's pretty fascinating. Pretty fascinating. So I will say this: there could be something going on there in Central Asia. Um, I'm not just going to dismiss it out of hand. And we have some really a lot of strange things going on. And people have been pointing me out these different sources and stuff. So this one's kind of interesting, written late 1600s, I guess, by I need to do a little more digging on who exactly these people were that wrote this. But this particular account is called The History of Genghis Khan the Great, first emperor of the ancient Moguls, or Mongols, we would call them today, and Tartars, in 4 books containing his life, advancement, conquests, etc., etc. So are they just using that term Tartar, and Eastern and Western Tartary? Are these other nations that we would just know under different names today, or were they entirely different entities that are just not being talked about much anymore? And then you can kind of see right in this description that those dark areas, as I call them, the stands, that we in the West really just have very little knowledge or understanding of anything that goes on in those countries whatsoever. Wikipedia tells us some little things here and there, and yeah, you can dig and find some more information on that, but really, I just mean collectively in our Western knowledge, we don't know much about these regions, so it's just a very mysterious area. But there's a lot of strange stuff about this that doesn't quite jive with the idea that it's just another label for known regions or what have you. One, for example, that my parents came up with, so they're not into conspiracy theories and stuff. I have been discussing flat Earth with them for several years, and my mom, I think, is on board with that. She definitely is, and I think my dad's coming around because he's starting to see the deceptions. And I don't know if he's 100% a flat earther, but he's definitely generally familiar with the biblical case for that now, and he's a strong Bible believer. And I think he does understand that there's a lot of deception in government and with these space agencies. And I think the recent Indian lunar missions really, I think he's paying attention to this stuff now and thinking it through. I don't know exactly where he is because he's not always very forthcoming. He's kind of, but I can tell he's thinking these things over. Um, And so they are not conspiracy theorists or hardcore truthers by any means, I wouldn't say. Um, but they were watching a documentary about North America and the early days of exploration there. And what was happening in those times is Western explorers were coming into North America. They would surveil these areas, and they would put these inscribed stone or metal markers as territory markers, boundary markers, um, basically claiming areas for themselves. And this is what the French did to claim, for example, what the U.S. eventually would buy from them as the Louisiana Purchase. They had all these French explorers and missionaries and traders and fur trappers going out, and these guys would actually just be claiming territory for France, for such and such, for so and so, and so they'd find these plaques, such and such an area, and this documentary was, I guess, about an archaeologist who specialized in these marker stones and these marker plaques and things like that, and so they were actually finding in North America these markers saying, we claim this area for Louis XYZ or so and so or what have you. And then another thing that was happening was the explorers they would intentionally seek out the boundary markers that others left and then take them. and then replace them with their own to kind of sneakily, try to steal claims from other people and stuff like that. But one thing that was fascinating is that my parents were saying that these markers were often in different languages, and one of the languages that they used sometimes was Tartarian. I'm like, what? Wait a second, what in the world? That just came out of left field and kind of surprised me because at this point I've been reading and watching some stuff on Mudfloods and Tartaria and stuff like that, and it's like, okay, why in the world? Why in the world would they be using that language, on these markers and stuff? And what exactly was that language? Is that just a placeholder or alternate name for some other Oriental language that we still have today, but like Chinese or whatever? I don't know. More research on my part is required to understand this, but there's definitely some weird little things that don't seem to quite fit with the narrative that all of this is just a conspiracy theory. But anyway, background. The theory of Great Tartaria as a suppressed lost land or civilization originated in Russia, with aspects first appearing in Anatoly Fomenko's New Chronology, then popularized by the racial occult history of Nikolai Levashov. In Russian pseudoscience, known for its nationalism, Tartaria is presented as the real name for Russia, which was maliciously ignored in the West. The Russian Geographical Society has debunked the conspiracy theory as an extremist fantasy, and far from denying the existence of the term, has used the opportunity to share numerous maps of Tartary in its collection. Since about 2016, conspiracy theories about the supposed lost empire of Tartaria have gained popularity on the internet, divorced from its original Russian nationalist frame. So it sounds like there's a drive from the Russians to connect themselves to this entity, Tartaria, or Tartary. Um, and I guess the counter narrative is that Russia was not connected to that, and it was more of a general regional term. Um, hmm, okay, but then, like I said, it's interesting that Tartarian is actually a language that, anyway. So here's where we get into the mudfloods and the quote unquote conspiracy theory aspects of this. And I want to just be clear that I'm on the fence right now about this stuff. As I said, I've not looked into this in enough depth to really have uh, a strong opinion on it either way. Just in my general interest in lost civilizations and lesser known history, this just kind of strikes up my interest. And I will say this, I'll leave the comments open on this video. By all means, feel free to give me some reference material to sift through. I can't promise that I'll get to it today, tomorrow, next week, next month, next year even. But this is something that really interests me, so if you've read anything on it, and I would say especially older sources, like primary sources, I pointed out this ebook that I dug up somewhere that someone at some point recommended to me from the 1600s probably. Um, Primary sources like that I especially like, but anything that can, give me a good overview or some deeper information on this stuff, by all means, feel free to drop some stuff in the down in the comments, and that'll help other people who watch this video and who are interested in actually studying this stuff out for themselves as well. Anyway, let me read this. The globalized version of the conspiracy theory is based on an alternative view of architectural history. Adherents propose that demolished buildings such as the Singer Building, the original New York Penn Station, or the temporary grounds of the 1915 World's Fair were actually the buildings of a vast empire based in Tartary. that has been suppressed from history. Sumptuously styled Gilded Age buildings are often held out as really having been built by the supposed Tartaria. Other buildings, such as the Great Pyramids and the White House, are further held out as Tartarian buildings. The conspiracy theory only vaguely describes how such a supposedly advanced civilization, which had repeatedly achieved world peace, could have fallen and been hidden. Okay, so let me say this. There may be a root of truth to the idea of Tartaria as an empire, even as one that had its own unique culture, language, and history, and that's being covered up for some reason. Um, and one reason I'm hearing that it has been suppressed is that it may have been a white Christian empire that was very wealthy and successful. And especially with Europe being under the Roman Catholic Church, they may have wanted to suppress um, other directions that, other groups may have gone, because the Catholic Church, remember, was all about suppression of knowledge, and their flavor of religion was the one that people had to practice. They were basically holding a monopoly on religion, using that to control the European kings and control the masses in Europe. And the Dark Ages are really where they cut Europe off from any kind of knowledge or outside technology. And there was a regression of knowledge and technology during that time. Anyway, so it's not beyond, it's not unreasonable, let me put it that way, that entire regions might have just been sort of like snipped out of collective memory or suppressed um, for various political reasons. It's definitely possible. Um, I do question the idea that it was a worldwide civilization that had achieved world peace. The reason for this is that's just not something that is within humanity's grasp. Um, I say that as a Bible believing Christian. World peace is something that we long for, but the scriptures are clear that there's only one Prince of Peace, that's Jesus. He's the only one who's going to achieve that, and he is not, uh, he's God. So he's perfect, he's sinless, he doesn't have a sin nature as we do. Human beings with their fallen sin nature, despite their best intentions, are corruptible, and world peace is not something that fallen humanity is going to be able to achieve on its own. The Antichrist is going to promise world peace, and a lot of people are going to believe him and think that he can deliver it, but he's not going to ultimately be able to do that. And we will find, after the Antichrist rises and establishes his power, that he's not really interested in world peace at all anyway. He's interested in domination, subjugation, and eradicating anyone who will not bow down and worship him, because he's essentially the avatar of Satan on Earth. So I do question this idea that it was advanced civilization that had reputedly achieved world peace. I will say this, because let me see if the book is over here. So the Iron Republic is one such example. I know that some of you guys who are truthers have looked into that book, the Iron Republic. I'm looking for, I don't think I have it near at hand here. I purchased another little book that was the root of the Vril Society. An occult secret society that the Nazis were interested in. So understand that about late 1800s, early 1900s, all these little novels started popping up, these science fiction novels. And the Iron Republic is really interesting because it seems like the writer of that one held to biblical cosmology to some degree, and it substantiates what the flat earthers, myself included, believe about this Earth realm, and so that's pretty fascinating. But these little books were popping up, and they were science fiction, and then one author sort of in this vein whose stuff really took off would be, I think it was Edgar Rice Burroughs, author of Tarzan and of the John Carter of Mars series. And he wrote many books in those series. Now, he did have more of a Marxist, Darwinian worldview, unfortunately. And so it's interesting that his books really took off and became popular, whereas some of these other ones didn't necessarily. Um, but forget the name of the one that inspired the Vril Society, and that was the idea that within a hollow Earth, that there was this race of supermen down there who mm, had sort of achieved transcendence and all this other stuff. These works were often political novels, and so they sort of presented these utopian fiction, I guess you could call it in a more general sense. They presented these. They explored the different challenges of society and government and so forth, and presented these societies that could potentially be utopian in nature. And so I do see some similarities with these. I'll just call it what this article calls it, conspiracy theories regarding Tartaria. So are some of these works coming from that era, where they do have these fictionalized empires and civilizations in hidden places around the world, and Shangri-La and things like that, that are intended to be didactic. These novels and these writings are allegorical. They're teaching some lessons. They're trying to make people think about politics, about religion, about philosophy, about government. And so I will just point that out because I do wander a little bit. And especially when we're talking about a supposedly suppressed world civilization that had achieved world peace, which seems pretty dubious to me, just based on what I know about human nature. So the idea that these buildings are that remnants of this empire are being demolished or repurposed, and sort of absorbed by modern civilizations. Let's talk about that a little bit. So one thing that I've been studying out is a biblical view of history. I've been going through this with my Sunday school class, and I usually try not to let that get off the rails. I haven't really talked about flat Earth stuff with them because the pastor of my church is. We've talked about it. He's kind of on the fence about that stuff, which is unfortunate because he does think outside the box, and when he preaches, he's preaching things that sometimes I'll just listen to a message and I'll think, man, he's right there, just another step, and he'd be a flat earther. And and this message that he's preaching, because he's going at it from just a biblical perspective, and he's pulling all these scriptures in their context, but he's missed it by just that much. Maybe one day. But I try not to get too much off into the conspiracy theory and these other things in Sunday school. I do try to keep it more. But there's some fascinating things in the book of Genesis. It talks about Cain built the first cities, for example. So that's within a generation of Adam. It wasn't too long before humans were doing metalworking. So the whole idea that there was, the Stone Age and yada yada before there's this progression, and it took a really long time for people to finally figure out how to do metalworking. Not true. The Bible says that people were very inventive early on, and it was not long. It was only a few generations from Adam that people figured out how to use all manner of metals. Um, the Bible teaches that humanity was made perfect and that we've been devolving ever since due to disease, due to, genetic load, due to moral decay, and then due to just loss of knowledge, from people groups getting wiped out and their collective knowledge and technology being destroyed. And so, actually, I would say there are parts of Tartarian theory, or the mudflood theory, if you want to call it that, that fit really well with the biblical account. That maybe we are actually, in some cases, rediscovering um, these these architecture basically from pre-flood of Noah, because the Bible says that God's purpose with the flood that covered the whole face of the earth, his purpose was to destroy all flesh off the face of the earth. It was not to necessarily wipe out all traces of civilization, all their buildings, all their technology. There may have been some megalithic structures that survived, and actually, when I think about it, I think it makes a ton of sense. And what would have happened in a flood? So I will say this: the idea that there's this worldwide empire, the Tartarian Empire, and that it was destroyed by a mud flood. Um, well, understand, just like with the flood of Noah, there would have been a lot of mud involved in that. So we have the fountains of the great deep. So that's under the earth being broken up. So I don't know what exactly that entails, whether we're talking deep sea vents um, on the seafloor, whether we're talking volcanoes, whether we're talking fault lines. So the fountains of the great deep were broken up. So we had waters and material coming up from below. And then we had the windows of heaven being open. So we had water coming down from above as well. And when the Bible says the windows of heaven, as a Bible believing flat earther now, I'm looking at that as apertures in the firmament crystal structure above us that separate this little bubble we live in. So understand that we live in a bubble, the earth realm, and it's a bubble that is between the waters below, the great deep, and the waters above. And so the windows of heaven being opened, the apertures in that firmament structure were opened to flood the earth realm during the flood of Noah. And everything died except for Noah and his family and the animals that were on the ark. And I believe that that was a literal event that actually happened. But so there would have been a lot of mud just stirred up in that process. And I've actually heard scholars, not necessarily coming from a conspiracy perspective or a flat earth perspective even, but they've said that in the Hebrew words used in that Old Testament account, this was a muddy rain that fell on the earth as these fountains and stuff were broken up and spewing mud and debris up high into the atmosphere, which was then raining down, just covering stuff. So I don't know that it was a very dirty flood. Let's just put it that way. And then, of course, all that water is obviously going to be eroding a ton of soil, silt, and other material, and then swirling that around and depositing everywhere. Um, so, is it possible that, there's a ton of infrastructure and architecture and road systems and other things that were just buried in mud and sediments? And then, which possibly over time later on, runoff water would slowly maybe erode and then reveal these cities that used to be there. Yeah, I think that is very possible. I think this idea, this concept, fits in very well with the biblical account because we know that, like I said, within a generation of Adam, people were building cities, and there was an entire civilization on the face of the earth that God decided to destroy because they just completely abandoned all truth, with the exception of Noah and his family. There was a very small godly remnant left, and God had just had enough of the things that they were doing. And they had high technology. My pastor has dug in detail on this. They were doing some weird stuff that sounds like it may have been almost like genetic modification of humanity and of animals. And there's some very strange things going on there in that world that probably related to their technology, and they were basically corrupting the natural order of things. God just decided to destroy that. Um, and my pastor thinks it's possible, and based on the biblical language and Bible references to this, there may have been even some weird stuff where they were trying to hybridize humans and animals and other bizarre stuff, tampering with strange flesh. Um, and they may have had high technology. I've watched some of these Antiquitech videos about lighthouses and things like that, and how with the lamps in these lighthouses, there's mechanisms attached to them that today we're not really sure exactly what they did, but it seemed like they had these mercury-driven rotary systems. And there's a lot of but you know these lighthouses get decommissioned. Parts are removed from these buildings, removed from the weather vanes that may have had to do with power generation. You know, these buildings have spires, like in this picture, and rotundas, and there were apparatus on top of these in many places. I've seen some videos talking about apparatus and actually showing pictures of some of the apparatus and suggesting that these things were actually energy collectors that were then powering these cities wirelessly. Um, a lot of strange, well, let's just say that people of the past have been very inventive, and it would not surprise me at all if, well, let's just say a lot of people have died mysterious deaths, like the guy who converted his truck to run on hydrogen, for example. There's just a lot of little weird things like that. Understand that fossil fuels and the monopoly that the establishment has on that allows them to generate a lot of money and keep people dependent on them. And so it's not really in their best interests to, you know, have people energy independent and being able to just get free energy from the Earth system. It's not in their best interests to allow people to have cures for cancers when they can sell treatments, or cures for other diseases when they can sell drugs for it, and so forth. Human corruption, it gets in the way of progress. Anyway, as I said, I do think it really makes sense that there are buildings on this earth that are pre-flood and ruins. You see this in, well, I have books and books about ancient mysteries here in my house. Um, there's some weird megalithic structures where it actually looks like stones were melted together, either maybe during ancient warfare or as part of the process of building the structures in the first place. They were just fused with incredible energy, and we don't know how that was done. And then these buildings often are partially in ruins, where there's an under level to them that clearly was made with highly sophisticated technology that we can't replicate. And then later peoples came and then they built on top of that and basically rebuilt the structures that were underneath. This happens a lot, and we just don't have a concept of where a lot of these peoples and these ruins were coming from. There's you know, ruins of writing that has been, it's still undeciphered. It probably always will be because the knowledge has just been lost. There's no point of reference. There's no context left of, you know, who the people were and things like that. This happens all the time, and I do think a lot of this stuff could be pre-flood. Um, and A lot of these giant structures are also industrial, I guess, is maybe the word I'm looking for. For example, the Great Pyramid of Giza, I am pretty much convinced at this point, based on my research, that it was a ram pump. A lot of people don't realize that there's an extensive canal system underneath all of Egypt and under the desert, and it was probably a massive irrigation system. And an engineer actually built a working ram pump using the Great Pyramid of Giza as a model. He just scaled it down, and it works. And a ram pump basically just uses gravity and you know, a water input to drive water and pump it out. And so it was probably this. So he said that, you know, if that's what the Great Pyramid of Giza was, this massive ram pump, and there's actually evidence that at the base of the pyramid there was once a very large reservoir lake with a retaining wall to hold the water in and things like that. And this system would have been used to pump water throughout Egypt and to irrigate it. It would have been very lush and beautiful using this underground tunnel system that the Egyptian Antiquity Authority is largely trying to keep people from becoming aware of. Um, Although I've seen videos and people talking about it, it's there. And this ram pump would have just driven water all throughout the land. And this engineer mentioned it would have just sounded like it would have had a very rhythmic thump that you just would have felt going out through the ground like a heartbeat. That would be you'd be able to feel it for tens of kilometers, and it would just be this cyclical thud that you would just hear as that because when we look at the Great Pyramid, there's no unlike so for the Valley of the Kings, for example, where all these hidden tombs are and stuff. There's tons of hieroglyphics in the Valley of the Kings and stuff like that, but not in the Great Pyramid. There's some graffiti in there, to my knowledge, but it was never intended to be a tomb. It's not carved ornately with, um, hieroglyphics and records and things like that. There's no evidence that anyone was ever buried in the Great Pyramid. And some of the chambers in there have a setup which has some unusual harmonic properties to it. And I'm not really a hardcore science guy, so I can't tell you exactly what that means, but there's some very unusual things about that building. It seems like it was more of an industrial um, building for the purposes of pumping water and possibly power generation, and not so much, not a tomb, which makes sense because it was a huge project, obviously, to build something like that. And so it would have needed to have had tremendous benefit to the entire nation for them to do that. And, a giant pump system that irrigated the entirety of Egypt, that definitely would have been something beneficial and worth building in order to reclaim the desert. And then the thought is that that was the first pyramid, but then that later pharaohs came and emulated that pyramid, um, but used their pyramids for different purposes. And so my thought on that is the Great Pyramid of Giza very well may have been a pre-flood construction. And maybe people came back into that region of Egypt and settled around it, and then either rebuilt it and got it working again, or maybe they never did. Maybe it has not been functional since the flood. I don't know. Don't really know about that. But interesting stuff. And I suspect that there's other megalithic structures around the world. Well, we know Stonehenge, for example, was probably some kind of calendar or timekeeping type system. We have ley lines and things like that. And there are like the Nazca lines in North America, some of these sculptures that are only visible from altitude. So wait a second, did people in the past have flight or hot air balloons or things like that? I think it's pretty likely. I think it's pretty likely. Or maybe they were flying on animals that were larger and allowed them to do that, riding animals that could fly. Don't know. But the Earth is much more mysterious than we know. We only understand a small fraction of history. A lot of it's been lost. Anyway, let's continue. In the conspiracy theory, the idea that a mud flood wiped out much of the world via depopulation, and thus old buildings, is common, supported by the fact that many buildings across the world have architectural elements like doors, windows, and archways submerged many feet below ground level. So I mentioned that the mound builders of North America were, I don't know if I want to really call them giants exactly, but it's not uncommon for them to be, for burials to be found where they're 7 to 8 feet tall. And I have a book actually on this that documents it by just laying out dozens, if not hundreds, of newspaper articles from the late 1800s. Well, the past. Let's just put it that way, of people opening up these mounds and discovering stuff. And these mounds were by no means uncommon. For example, I think it was St. Louis was actually built on the site of one of these mound builder cities, and there were dozens of mounds in the area. Dozens. There's some island off the East Coast. I forget where exactly it was. Again, you know what? I think it was that island where the what was that island's name? Is it Jekyll Island? It might be Jekyll Island. Maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe I'm getting that confused. There were a lot of burial sites on Jekyll Island, though, which is the island where um, a lot of the Illuminati families, I guess you could call them, met to put together the Federal Reserve. Um, anyway, I got off on a rabbit trail and I got lost. Oh yeah, windows, archways submerged many feet below ground level. Giants, mound builders. Yeah, 78 feet tall. I don't know that I technically would call those giants because we have NBA players that are in that range today. So it's not outside of the possibility of, human characteristics, certainly. But yeah, we know that the mound builder peoples, like I said, some of them had red hair and beards, and they were 7 to 8 feet tall, big people. But you look at some of these buildings in Eastern Europe and in places in Asia. What's fascinating about it is the size of the buildings and the size of the windows and doors. And it's fascinating to me because they've been repurposed as, studios and warehouses and things like that. But the scale of the buildings is just unrealistic. And it's like, why would you build a building like that? You understand that in these cold regions, you've got to heat that airspace inside of a building. So why would you build it so big? With these double high ceilings and things like that, and these huge double wide, very tall doors. Well, they were built for bigger people. And there's actually a thought that Noah and his family were quite large, bigger than people are today, and that Adam and Eve, by modern standards, they may have been considered giants. And it's not a crazy thing to think about because it's likely that conditions on Earth were very different in the past. Higher atmospheric pressure, higher concentration of oxygen, those two things together would result in bigger organisms, um, including bigger people. And the Bible does tell us outright that yes, there have been giants at different points in the past. There have been human giants, just due to genetics, and then there have been giants that are these um, half human, half angelic hybrids. I always used to be on the fence about that, but after digging into the actual biblical language, it seems pretty clear that that's what the Bible's talking about. And there's a lot of interesting scripture about that. Anyway, continuing on. Um, Both World War I and II are cited as a way in which Tartaria was destroyed and hidden, reflecting the reality that the extensive bombing campaigns did destroy many historic buildings. That's definitely true. General evidence for the theory is that there are similar styles of buildings around the world, such as capitol buildings with domes or star forts. Yeah, domes, cathedral-type structures, and capitol buildings with this sort of Greco-Roman, I don't know what you want to call it, imperial-type architecture. Um, the interesting thing about that, I did see an entire video about capitol buildings, and that is fascinating to think about. The capitol buildings of the 50 United States are astounding. Astounding masterpieces of architecture. And you understand that, like during the cowboy era and stuff, you have these, like clapboard shanty towns and stuff popping up. So who exactly is quarrying the marble and other materials for these capitol buildings? Who exactly is paying for these buildings? And you look at the dates that some of these buildings are being constructed. Who is building these buildings? It is truly something that makes you scratch your head and think a little bit. And so there's some concepts, some ideas here. One idea is that these buildings were there already and that they're just being excavated and refurbished, basically, as people move west. Possible. Yeah. Yep, that is possible. I'm on the fence about that though. Um, I would probably want to see some references to things like that in the writings of pioneers and mountain men and French missionaries and stuff like that. And if you know of any, by all means, put those down in the comments of people who were on the American frontier. They were on the frontier of civilization, and they were actually coming across these ruins and stuff, and documenting that. That would be awesome. I'd love to see that in primary sources. And if you guys know of anything like that, give it to me. Another thought, though, is that the builders of the ancient cathedrals in Europe, by that point in time, had moved here, and they were behind the building of these Capitol buildings. And I think that is a very likely possibility because we know that secret societies, especially Freemasonry, came over to this country, and by about the year 1800, they were very well established, and they actually take credit for implementing the public education system not only in Europe but in the United States as well. And understand that the Freemasons, their roots were actually ancient stonemasons. They are the ones who built the cathedrals of Europe, most likely, anyway. Not really known with 100% certainty, but I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think it makes a lot of sense that those people and their power structures came here. For the same reasons that the Protestant groups came here for religious freedom, because understand, in under the Catholic Church in Europe, you could not, these Protestant forms of Christianity, the Catholic Church frowned on them, but the Catholic Church also frowned upon secret societies and Satanism. And so, just like your Puritans and your separatists, uh, um, pilgrims came here to the United States for religious freedom, other groups came here for religious freedom as well, darker and occult groups. And you can see that by looking at these these old historic graveyards in the U.S. You'll find Christian symbols on the gravestones. You'll find occult symbols. You'll find obelisks. You'll find symbols of secret societies. This country's always been a battleground between good and evil. Many people have wanted America to be different things. Um, Star forts, that's also pretty interesting stuff. And domes. Yeah, not sure what's up with that, but do some research on the Antiquitech and spires and the technology that was installed at the top of these spires and towers, and there's something to it. Something to it. Anyway, many photographs from the turn of the 20th century appear to show deserted city streets in many capital cities across the world. So the thought behind that is maybe there were depopulation events, and then this kind of goes along with the orphan train ideas, like where were these orphans coming from? Why were there so many orphans? I will say this about this though, if you know anything about very old technology, the exposure time, like when you take a picture with your smartphone, the exposure time is near instantaneous. You still do need to kind of hold it steady and not be moving it around too much while you're taking the picture so you don't blur it. But the exposure time is really quick. But it was not that way initially. Sometimes you would have to expose your negative or whatever, your plate, for minutes or longer in order to get a picture. And so what that resulted in was when you're taking a picture of, say, a cityscape, anything that's moving like carts, people, unless it's standing in place for the entire time that exposure is that film's being exposed, film or plate or photographic plate or whatever is being used is being exposed, unless someone is staying completely stationary, they're not going to show up in that picture. Only the big backdrop that's staying stationary, so the buildings, the streets, the landscape, that stuff is going to be captured. But anything that's moving, or even if it's standing still for the duration, but it's moving a little bit. So if you had, for example, a cart and donkey, the donkey might look a little blurry because at points it's moving around and actually messing with the exposure process. Whereas everything else, like the buildings and stuff, they're going to look pretty crisp and clear because, they're stationary, they're not moving. And so that's the reason why in a lot of these early photographs, people just aren't showing. It's not necessarily that the people weren't there. It's that because it's small moving objects, they weren't staying stationary long enough for that 20-minute exposure time or whatever to actually pick them up in the final photograph. When people do start to appear in the photographs, there's a striking contrast between the horse and cart dwellers in the muddy streets and the elaborate, highly ornate stone megastructures which tower above the inhabitants of the cities. Yeah, that's definitely true. It is pretty weird and pretty stark to see those pictures, which is seen even in modern cities where extreme poverty is contrasted with skyscrapers. That's true too. That's a valid point. And I think it's always been this way. I think it's always been this way where the super rich and powerful have so much more than the common guy at the bottom. Um, and I've mentioned in other videos, and I may do more videos in the future, there's restricted technology that's being kept from us. It'll be used to deceive, manipulate, control, or possibly even destroy the people in the future by those who rule this world system. We can't even conceive of some of the abilities and capabilities that they have and that they're keeping from us. Yeah, it's I think it's always been this way. So while it's seeing these photos and stuff is pretty staggering, and how poor the people were, even the people who are working on the buildings and stuff, how they look compared to the structures and how ornate and things they are. But I don't necessarily think that that's proof in and of itself of this greater conspiracy to cover things up or to reclaim these buildings from another time necessarily. I think there's always been a tremendous gap between the wealthy and powerful and the little guy. This person, Zach Mortiz, writing for Bloomberg, believes that the theory reflects a cultural discontent with modernism and a supposition that traditional styles are inherently good and modern styles are bad. He describes the theory as the QAnon of architecture. And I think there is some truth to that. This is kind of the seesaw effect. We're in a period where people are waking up. They're seeing that the establishment is evil, Luciferian, Illuminati. These corrupt families have conspired to fix the system. Money was meant to be a store of value and a way of transferring wealth, but the powers that be have really captured and corrupted it, and now the money system is a way of just stealing the people's labor and robbing them and giving that wealth to those who control our world system, the elite, the so-called elites or the establishment, whatever you want to call them. And if you think about it, they're taxing you over and over and over and over again. And 100 years ago, there was no income tax. And now you're just being taxed over and over and over again at the federal level, at the state level. There's tariffs on goods, then you're paying sales tax, and then you're paying income tax, and then you're paying capital gains tax, you're paying taxes on inheritance. If you take money out of your own retirement, you're paying penalty taxes on that. Taxes, taxes, taxes. There's taxes on your cell phone bills and stuff like that. There's taxes on, oh man, anything you can think of. Taxes. There's special taxes on luxury goods and what are seen as vice, like vices. So cigarettes and alcohol, extra taxes. There's taxes on gasoline. Um, you name it. You name it. The government the establishment takes a huge cut of everything that you make. So at some point, we got to ask the question, are we all de facto slaves to the system? Yeah, I would say we pretty much are. And I think that's why there's a drive right now. People are starting to wake up and see, yeah, we need to be more independent, food independence especially. So we need to be getting back to these small farmettes where we're raising animals, raising crops, having gardens and things like that, homeschooling our kids, getting away from the establishment's ways of doing things, and teaching our kids to think for themselves and to be more self-sufficient, because the establishment doesn't care about us. If anything, they want to depopulate us. And so we need to stand on our own 2 feet. And I think that's where this movement's coming from. And I think that there is a great deal of cultural discontent with modernism right now, or I should say with the version of modernism that's been forced on us, because this Earth system could be a lot better than it is with all the technology and knowledge that we have available. When I say we, I mean as humanity. The problem is that a lot of that's just being withheld from the people or controlled due to greed to make money. And so traditional styles and getting back to living uh, a more based life, um, closer to nature as the creator intended. Yeah, there is a view that that's better. Better. We need to get back to that. It's healthier. Um, and I would agree with that in general. I mean, some people love the idea of living in these cities made of metal and glass. More power to them. They can do that if they want, but I'd rather not. I see those places as prisons. I don't want to live in a city. Um, but yeah, I can see some of the reasons why people are starting to question things and to think for themselves. And I do think that there's more to this Tartarian mudflood thing than meets the eye. I think there's something there. Um, the establishment wants to just shrug it all off as nothing, but I do think there's a kernel of something there. And as I mentioned, I think it fits well with the biblical account and the biblical flood. That some of this stuff may be precursor technology from the world that was before. It would not surprise me in the least. All right, well, thank you guys for listening. I hope you found this to be interesting. And as I mentioned, please feel free to leave references down in the comments, if you know any that are really good books that have been helpful to you about understanding some of this stuff and things like that. I love to read. I love to study. I don't have nearly enough time to do it, but yeah, I'd appreciate any help you guys can give me. All right, well, thanks. Have a good one.